Asynchronous JavaScript is used all over the web to send and receive data from API endpoints. So today, we're going to take a look at exactly what an API endpoint is, what a promise is, the async await, and some of the more basic async JavaScript. Let's take a look at it. So what exactly is an API? Well, API stands for Application Programmable Interface, and it's generally an endpoint somewhere on the internet where you can send and receive data from using JSON. Well, hang on a second, what exactly is JSON? Well, JSON is JavaScript object notation, and is basically the standard anymore for sending and receiving data. So let's take a look at exactly what an API is and how we can send and receive data. Now, some of you may have already noticed, but I've already got our API open over here. This is SWAPI. SWAPI is the Star Wars API, and this is where we're going to be receiving our data from. And we can actually already create requests inside of their own website. So let's just go ahead and try to make a request. So it says people/1. Now let's hit the request button and see what happens. Okay, so it looks like it already pulled the data. So it looks like it pulled this information right here. So we've got a name for Luke Skywalker, and then we've got all kinds of information that's being sent back. And this is how an API works. You send off a request, the server does something, and then it sends back a response in the form of JSON. This right here is JSON. So now that we've seen a basic understanding of how it works, let's go ahead and see how it works inside of the code. So I've gone ahead and saved our URL for our API endpoint inside of a constant here called URL. And if you didn't know, URLs, no matter if it's going to an API or not, are always going to be saved as strings inside of your JavaScript code. So let's go ahead and utilize this URL some. So the way that we're going to do this is we're going to use what's called the fetch API. And this is a built-in mechanism to JavaScript that allows us to send and receive data from APIs. So let's go ahead and just say fetch, and we're going to pass in our URL. And let's just go ahead and save this to a constant real quick. We'll say request. We'll set that equal to the fetch and passing in the URL. Now, if we save that, we're not going to see anything just yet. And that's because we're not logging it out. So let's just go ahead and console.log the request. And if we save that now, we get a promise. Now, what exactly is this promise? Well, a promise is a way of JavaScript keeping track of all the different requests that it's making. And these promises, they have three separate states. It could be a pending state, which means we've sent the request, but we haven't received any data back yet. We also have a fulfilled state where you can see that right here, where we have sent the request and we've received the data back successfully. We also have a third rejected state where the data has been sent, but something went wrong. Maybe the server's down, maybe we don't have access to that specific API endpoint. Whatever the case may be, we could also have a rejected state. So why exactly do we need these promises? Well, if you didn't know, JavaScript parses the file from the top to the bottom, and it can only run one line of code at a time. And if we send one of these requests, and even if it's a bigger request, we don't know how long it's going to take for that server to get that information back to us. So we create these requests and then we pass it off to the browser, and the browser is the one that handles the state of that request. So whenever we pass it to the browser, it's going to send that API that request, and then whenever we get it back, the browser is going to receive it, and it's basically going to say, hey JavaScript, I've got your request back, now you can do whatever you want with it. This allows JavaScript to continue to parse the file while we're still waiting on the request, and this is what's called synchronous JavaScript. But now that I've talked your ear off about how these requests work, let's actually see it in action and see how we can utilize the information that we're getting back. But now that we've successfully got our data back, what do we do next? Well, at the end of this fetch request here, we can actually chain on another method called .then. And this .then method is going to run after we have successfully gotten the fulfilled status. So whenever this status changed from pending to fulfilled, this .then method is then going to run. And the way that this works is it's going to accept a callback function. And this callback function is going to receive the data. So we can name this whatever we want. We could say this is the request. And whenever we receive this request, we can do something with it. So let's just go ahead and console.log the request here. And let's actually go down here and let's just console.log running some more code. And this will make sense here in just a second. So if we save this, what we're going to see pop up over here is we're going to see that promise, which is this request right here being logged out. Then we are going to see this code being ran, and then we're going to see this console log right here logging out that request that we called in the .then method. So the way that this worked was that we sent the request, then JavaScript continued to parse this file, and it continued to run the code inside of this file until we got that fulfilled status on our promise over here. And then once we got that fulfilled status, then we ran this .then method and it logged out that response that we got from our server. So let's now take a look at this response object here. Now this response object was logged out inside of this .then method right here. And this is what was passed from the fetch URL to the .then method whenever we called the .then method. This is the fulfilled request right here. So this is the response that we got back from the server. So in here we've got all kinds of information. We've got the body, which is a readable stream, and I'll explain that here in just a second. And then we've got an OK status, which is true, which means that the response is okay and we're good to go. We've also got a status of 200, which means, again, this is good to go. A 200 status code is a good thing. Then we've got the status text, which we don't have any status text, and then we've got the URL that we sent it to. Now this body right here, which is a readable stream, this is what we're going to get back from a request over the internet. So the way that it works is that whenever the server is sending information, it cannot send JSON data over the internet. It has to convert it to a string. So what it does is it converts it to a string, and then it sends it over to the receiver, which is us, and then we have to unpack that information. And the way that we unpack that information is actually going to be inside of the .then method. So let's go ahead, and we're actually going to just return from this .then method. We're going to return the request. So this request right here that we're receiving inside of this callback method, and we're going to call on that .json. And this is a method that's going to convert that readable stream into a JSON format that we can actually read. But the thing of it is, this .json method, it's going to return a promise as well. So we actually need to chain on another .then method to the end of this one. And we can continue to do this as many times as we want. We can actually chain on as many .then methods as we want. So down here, after this initial .then, we're going to chain on another .then. And this is going to be where we're going to actually get the data. So the fetch request is going to create a promise. Then the .then method is then going to convert that promise or that data that we receive back into a JSON readable format that we can actually read. Then we're going to do something else with it, and we're going to receive the data itself down here, and we can actually just console.log this data here. Now if we save this, we're going to see this right here. This is the actual data that the server sent back to us. It went through this entire process just to get down here. And this is synchronous JavaScript. This is how we can send and receive data from the internet. Now that whole thing may have been a little bit confusing, so let's go ahead and walk through this step by step again. So let's go ahead and comment that out, and we're just going to create a new request. Now I'm not actually going to create a constant here because this was just shown to show the promise here itself. So let's just go ahead and create the fetch. and we're going to pass in our URL. And then this is going to create that promise, and then JavaScript after that is going to continue running the code. Then after we get that promise back, or that fulfilled data back, we are going to receive that in a response, and it's going to be automatically passed to this .then method. And then inside of this .then method, we are going to return that response, and we're going to convert that response to JSON. And this, of course, creates a new promise that we have to deal with. So, to deal with that, we're actually going to chain on a second .then method. So we could say .then, and whenever this is resolved completely, then it's going to pass that resolved JSON data to this next .then method, which we then can receive inside of our callback function, and I'm going to just name it data. Now inside of this last .then method, we are actually going to receive the actual data that we want. So we can actually console.log the data that we actually received from this second or this first .then method. So when all said and done, we are going to receive all of the data that is eventually converted to a JSON format that we can actually read and we can actually utilize inside of our JavaScript code. Now, so far we've actually been writing these requests with the assumption that we're always going to get a fulfilled response back. But what happens if we don't? What happens if something goes wrong? The server's down, maybe the URL has been changed or something along those lines. What do we do then? Well, we actually can chain on another method at the end of this .then here. We can actually chain on another method called catch. And what this is going to do is it's actually going to catch any errors, or if it's rejected, it's going to catch that, and then we can handle it inside of this catch method. So we can actually receive the error inside of here, and this works almost identically to the .then methods, and we can actually handle the error inside of here. So if anything here throws an error of any kind, we can then receive it here. We can actually catch it with this .catch method, and that error will then be passed to the .catch method, and we can handle it down here. So let's just go ahead and console.log that error. And let's actually simulate a bad request. So let's go ahead and duplicate our response, and let's just say that this is going to be the request that we're going to send. Now we know that this is going to return an error. So let's go ahead and see what happens. So we get syntax error unexpected token. Now let's actually go ahead and just console.log this response here. See what we actually get back. So if we save that, we're going to get an actual response back, and we're going to see the response is okay with false here, and we're going to get a status of 404. Now, status codes are a whole different story. We're not going to get too deep into status codes, but anything within 200 range is going to be a good status code. Anything with a 400 or 500 range is going to be a bad status code. Now, we actually got a fulfilled response, so we can actually see if we const request is equal to this, and let's go ahead and just console.log this request. And if we save that, we give it a second, and then we open it up, we actually got a fulfilled request. But how do we get a fulfilled request whenever we aren't sending the proper API endpoint? Well, this is another bit of confusion on asynchronous JavaScript and synchronous JavaScript, where even if we do have a bad request, it's still going to fulfill that request, and it's going to give us a fulfilled request. But the problem is the response is not actually valid. So inside of the first .then, whenever we get the response back, we need to check that response to make sure it is okay. So let's go ahead and instead of that log, let's just throw an if statement in here, and we're going to check to see if the response.ok, and we're going to check to see if it is false. So if it is false, then this is going to convert it to true, and we're going to know that we have an issue. So let's go ahead and we're going to throw an error. And inside of here, we can actually pass in our error message. So we could say there was an issue with your request. And if we save that now, we are actually going to get an error. There was an issue with your request, and this was logged out at line 23. Right here inside of the catch method. So this catch method, not only is it going to catch if a response is rejected, but it's also going to catch if we have an error. So we need to actually check to make sure that these requests are coming back okay before we do anything, because if we try to do something on a bad request, or a bad response I should say, then it's just going to break everything. It's not going to actually work. So we actually need to handle any kinds of errors that we get back. Now, we've seen pending promises and we've seen fulfilled promises, but what about a rejected promise? Well, generally you won't see a rejected promise coming back from a server. Rather, you'll see a fulfilled promise with an error code inside of it, or a status of not okay. But we can actually simulate a rejected promise here. So in the same fashion that we threw this error here, we can actually do that same thing with the promise constructor. So let's just check to see if the response.ok is not okay. So we can say response.ok is not okay. Then inside of here, we can actually return promise.reject, and we could pass in a reason for reject. And generally you want to create a new instance of an error, just like up here. So we could say new error, and we could pass in the reason. So we could say there was an error with the request. And if we save that, that error is actually going to be caught again by the catch method down here. Now, we didn't actually see a rejected promise. So how do we see that? Well, we can actually say const rejected is equal to promise.reject, and we could say there was an issue. And this is going to pop regardless because we haven't checked if anything, but we'll just go ahead and console.log this rejected value here. And if we look at the rejected promise here, we originally got the fulfilled promise from this right here, but then we got this rejected promise, which was then rejected by this promise.reject, and then we passed in the reason here as there was an issue. And then down here, we checked and we returned a rejected promise with a new error here, and then this right here was caught by this down here. So this is how you can simulate a rejected promise. Generally, you'll just do this right here, where you check to see if the promise is okay, and if it is, then it will not run. If it's not okay though, then this will run and the catch method will catch it. Now this right here has been the synchronous way of dealing with promises. So JavaScript creates the promise and then it continues to parse the file, and it'll go back to that request or that promise whenever it is resolved or rejected. But there's a different way, an asynchronous way, where we can just wait for the promise. And let's go ahead and take a look at that next. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete all of this, and I'm going to delete this, and we will uncomment this out here. Now we can actually create an asynchronous function that will then wait for this request to completely resolve before we do anything else. So we can go ahead and create a function here, and let's just go ahead and call this getData. And inside of this function, let's just go ahead and call our fetch function, and we're going to pass in our URL as normal. Now I'm going to go ahead and save this into a constant called response. and we're going to set that equal to the fetch passing in the URL. Now in front of this fetch function, we're actually going to say await. And this await keyword, whenever this function gets called and this await keyword is encountered, then it's going to halt the execution of this function until we get a resolved response back from this fetch request. So whenever this function is executed, so let's just go ahead and execute the function. Then whenever this function is executed, this is going to wait for that response to come back. So let's go ahead and just console.log that response. And wait a minute, we can't actually use this here according to my VS Code. And that's true, because we have not defined this function as an async function. So to define this as an async function, we just need to go in front of the function declaration here, and we just need to define the async keyword here. And this async keyword is going to tell JavaScript that this function is an asynchronous function. So it's going to basically say, hey, look out for the await keyword in here, and whenever you encounter the await keyword, then we are going to just wait for that, and then we're going to go ahead and run some more code while we wait for that. So let's go ahead and save this and see what we get. So you see that we get running some more code logged out first, and that's because, of course, we are calling this function, and then whenever we call this function, we are initially awaiting this right here. So as we're waiting, JavaScript is going to go ahead and continue with the execution of the rest of the code outside of the function. Then once we get a response back, that response is going to be saved inside of this response variable here, and then it's going to be logged out to the console. And we could say this more clearly if we say console.log, we got the data back. So this will not run until we get a response back from this right here. And you can see that we got this running some more code that logged out down here, logged out before we actually got this logged out here, and then it was logged out again before this was logged out as well. So this will wait for this to actually return, and then it will save it inside of this variable. Now we can actually do the exact same thing that we did before. So we can actually say const data is equal to await again, and we are going to take that response and we're going to convert that to JSON, just like we did before with the .then method. Now we can just go ahead and console.log that data. So whenever this function gets called, it's going to await this fetch right here. So then after that, it's going to continue running this code outside of the function. Then once that data comes back, we are then going to save it inside of this response variable. Then we are going to create another constant called data, and we are going to await that response.json. So this is another one that returns a promise. So we are going to await for that to get finished as well. And then once that is done and that promise has been fulfilled, then we're going to save that value inside of this data constant. Then we just log out that data constant once everything is all done. So let's go ahead and save that and see what happens. So we can see we again got the data resolved and it's been converted into JSON format. Now, how can we handle errors inside of an asynchronous function? Well, we can actually check the response just like we did with the .then methods. We can actually check the response. So we can say response.ok, and if that's not okay, then we can handle the error inside of here ourselves. So we could say return console.log there was an error, and if we fudge this a little bit and we save this, now we can see logged out to the console there was an error, and we can actually handle that directly inside of the asynchronous function, or we can define a separate function that can then be called whenever we run into an error. However you want to set it up, it's really all up to you in the end of the day. Now you may also be thinking, can I return that data from that function? And the answer is Kinda. So let's take a look at it and see what happens. So let's just go ahead and instead of logging, we're going to return that data variable from this async function here. And let's just go ahead and console.log. And normally you would think that we are going to get that data returned to us inside of that console.log. But not really. The async function is always actually going to return a promise. No matter what, it's going to return a promise. So you can see that here we got that promise returned and then logged out whenever we call that function here. Now, if you really want to do it this way, if you really want to return the data and you get that promise, you can actually chain on a .then method, and it's actually going to return that data inside of a promise. It's not going to be like before where we had the response and then we had to chain another .then. No, it's just going to actually just return the data inside of a promise. So we could just say we're getting the data, and we could just console.log the data inside of the .then method. And if we save that, then we are going to get that data logged out to the console. But there's no real way that we can pull that data out of either the .then or out of the async function. It's just there. You have to deal with it the way that it is. Now, the .then method actually has another argument that we can pass in. And this argument is whenever a promise gets rejected, it's actually going to handle when a promise gets rejected. So let's take a look at this and let's actually check to make sure if the response is not okay, then we're going to reject the promise. So we're going to say promise.reject, and we're going to pass in the reason. So we're going to say there was an issue. And if we reject that promise and then we return that promise from the async function back to here, we can actually handle that inside of the .then by passing in a second callback. So the second callback is going to be the on rejection. So if it's fulfilled, then we can call this, and if it is rejected, we can call this second method here. So we could say reason, and we could pass in, we could say return console.log reason. And if we save that and we actually fudge up the API endpoint here a minute, then we can see that there was an issue and this promise was not okay. So we returned a rejected promise with this issue right here. So then whenever we called the .then, it saw that it was rejected, so instead of calling this one, it actually called this one, and it returned a console log with that reason that was passed in. That is this right here that was automatically passed to the second function call here. And this kind of thing right here is what makes this kind of stuff so confusing, because there's so many different ways that you can do something and so many people have different opinions about how you should do it, and it just gets so confusing whenever you're first trying to learn how to do this stuff. So just focus on one specific way on how you do it, and then once you grasp the basic concept of it, you grab the core idea of how it works, then you can kind of start branching off onto other ways of how you can do it. I was just showing you some of the many ways that you can actually do this, and there's actually a lot more ways that you can do something like this. You can create a new promise just by using the promise constructor, and you can handle promises directly with the promise constructor. You could go back to the old way of callback hell, which I am not going to show you in this video. And there's all kinds of different things that you can actually do, and so many different ways that you can actually do it. So find a good way that fits for you, as long as you are handling all of your errors, handling all of your rejections, and making sure that everything works properly. That's the only thing that you really need to pull out of this video. So don't get caught up on the little details, just focus on the core concepts, and then branch off as you need to or as you want to once you understand the core concepts. And with that, I think I'll let you go. Now, if you inevitably have any questions, you can drop them down in the comments section down below. I'll answer any questions that you might have. Otherwise, if you did find the video enjoyable, make sure you slap a like on it. Check out the full playlist, link is right next to me. Make sure you subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.